All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And I'm happy to welcome back. It's been a long time, but friend Michael Steele, former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, former RNC Chairman, currently the host of The Weekend on MSNBC. Michael Steele, great to see you.
Hey, man, it's good to see you. It's good to connect again. It's I was saying to you a little bit earlier, I was watching you this morning. Morning, Joe, doing your thing, cutting it up a little bit. I love it. But it's nice to have the conversation because, you and I have been in this space a long time, and it's just been amazing to watch the breakdown. And so to be able to sort of,
it's insane. The first time I met you, the first time I met you was at the Philadelphia Republican Convention in 2000, 25 years ago. But I think we're both a lot of things have changed, but we're doing great. You are rocking over at MSNBC. But let's start with the craziness, right? When I invited you on, we were having these tariffs, these quote unquote reciprocal tariffs. They weren't reciprocal, but that's what they were called. And since then, Donald Trump has, changed direction a little bit. What do you make of that? And did he blink, or is this the art of the deal?
No, it's the art of capitulation. Donald Trump doesn't. I mean, look, The Art of the Deal was a book he didn't write. And so let's be clear. He's, he may have, I think he was at Wharton, but didn't get a degree. I mean, there's so much about him. He's not a developer. He puts his name on buildings. So he's a master marketer. He is, as I've termed him, the P.T. Barnum of our age politically. And so this is just a classic example of a guy who is in a job and he has no fundamental understanding of the role that the job requires him to play right now. Look, you and I will likely agree that, the biggest economic threat out there right now is China. The biggest geopolitical / national security threat is Russia. And so how our country deals with these two big behemoths matters. To have a president who's a sycophant in the case of Russia and fundamentally does not understand the economics with respect to China puts us in the position where, he goes out and has a national liberation day, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, only to back off the liberation. And so it becomes national capitulation. There aren't 75 countries out there lining up, beating down the White House door to sit down to negotiate the tariff. He does, their way out of Trump's tariffs. He doesn't hold all the cards, but he tells us he does. Yeah. And with a compliant, afraid press, legal and judicial community, he gets away with a lot of crap. And so it's important that reasoned voices out there point that out and tell people, no, he got no clothes on. That is a high white ass you see right now that does not get the orange suntan like his face does.
Well, the scary thing is, and look, I don't know, I am no economic expert, but from what I can gather about the bond market, it's very serious. And a lot of America's, a lot of the reason that we can spend beyond our means is that we have this good reputation that America has earned over years of being reliable and having the rule of law and kind of a safe place to park your money if you want to do that in the American dollar. And it feels like what Trump may be doing is, as he himself is being exposed as a bullshitter, he may simultaneously be exposing America as the man, there is no man behind the curtain kind of thing. That's what concerns me. And even though the market bounced back right after he lifted those quote unquote reciprocal tariffs, I'm not sure that we're out of the woods at all. And it concerns me that that Trump may be really eroding some things that we spent a long time building.
Look, he's absolutely eroding a lot of things that we spent a long time building up. You though put your finger on a very interesting point that I have concluded come to conclude over the last few months, and I'll get to that in a moment. But to the point you level up right now, yes, there's a lot that the U.S. has tolerated because it's been in its interest to tolerate. From the end of the Second World War to this past January when Trump was inaugurated, and even in the first term, there was a at least with Trump, a thin line, but certainly more broadly with his predecessors, a firm understanding of the role that America would play, not just in terms of settling the world order, but creating a different world order after World War II. And so there was a lot of winking and nodding and turning the head to things that would on its face be problematic because there was a larger game to be played and more gains to get for the U.S. So yeah, we enter into arrangements with some of our partners economically where they have the upper hand. Why? Because short term, who cares? Longer term, we're getting other benefits that work for us. It's a combination of direct power versus soft power at any given time in any given relationship. So yeah, with our allies, we can have tariffs that are, not tariffs, but we can have trade imbalances that are a little bit more disadvantaged to us because we get to control the shots on everything else.
Can I make a very crude analogy here? Which I think it's sort of like when you're a guy and you go out on a date, maybe you have to pick up the check. And you might think the game's rigged. It's not fair.
Right.
I'm out with the girl. I'm always paying for the bill. But guys had it pretty good for a long time when they were picking up the bill. You know what I mean?
Right.
And opening the door. And their chivalry worked out pretty well for a long time for a lot of guys over the course of history. And it would be like complaining about that. Like, why am I always having to pay for dinner? I'm like, hey, you got a pretty good deal.
You got a pretty good deal. Well, first off, the deal is she's letting you take her out. All right, that's the deal. And part of that is, okay, let me see what kind of man you are. Let me see how much you compliment me, how much you are attendant to my conversation, etc. So yeah, there is, and that's true for our relationships. Our allies expect certain things from us as we go into these relationships. And so the fact that Trump fundamentally doesn't understand that is one thing. The other side of it is, which I think for me exposes a harsher truth for Republicans, especially Republicans, like myself. Look, next year I get to celebrate 50 years as a Republican. And I was thinking, I don't know how much of a celebration that's going to be. But I've been in the party, my first presidential election, 1976. And I've been thinking long and hard about that journey of what drew me into the party and the things that animated me. But most importantly, why I never identified myself as a Republican, RNC Republican, but always as a Lincoln Republican, because it was those foundational ideas of the Constitution is there for everybody, not just some. And that we as a party always stood for that. All the other bullshit aside, look, folks, we didn't put a pro-life plank into our platform until 1980 because we culturally believe those things were matters that were left between individual states, left to individuals, but the government had no role there. So we, from a political standpoint, no need to politicize something that we don't ultimately get to decide. You get to make those decisions. And that, again, was showing respect for the individual liberties to make those decisions. We're a long way from that. So it got me thinking, Matt, perhaps Eisenhower, Reagan, Bush 41, those guys and the policies that they level up, shining city on a hill, 1,000 points of light, integrating the military, maybe that was the aberration.
Yeah.
And in fact, what Trump has exposed is what the Republican Party has been since Reconstruction. And it's been this internal demons that they've had to battle with. Because when you stop and think about it, we capitulated too quick after Lincoln died to fall back on and level up, allowed to be leveled up, a Jim Crow environment or space. And even the resistance to civil rights in the 30s, culminating in Goldwater absolutely rejecting it and walking away from it in 64. Nixon's Southern strategy in 68. These things to me got me thinking, say, well, maybe this idea of free markets, free enterprise, freedom for individual rights and liberties, maybe that's been the lie that we've told ourselves as what was metastasized or had metastasized into the party is something a lot darker, which has now been exposed. And clearly our leadership is all on board for it, because I don't hear anybody putting down Putin. Who's talking about the evil empire the way Reagan did?
Yep.
We're patting this guy on the back. We're crucifying just this past week our ally in Ukraine. So I don't see the value anymore of what Republicans offer up, because it's not attached to at least the things that I recognized when I decided to become a Republican, against great advice from a lot of people growing up in Washington, D.C. My mama looking at me going, why the hell you want to do that? I was like, well, you raised me well, Mom. You just raised me well. So
I think that you're right. And I think that, so, you have the Great Depression, you have World War II. So the Great Depression sort of undermines the idea that tariffs work.
Hello.
World War II undermines isolationism and authoritarianism. And then you have the Cold War. And that's when you and I came of age. And I
That's
think
right.
that is the key. I think as long as the Cold War was there, that was the glue that united the various disparate wings of conservatism.
Yep.
And it gave even people like Pat Buchanan an excuse to join in with the Reagan vision, and which was really the Kennedy vision, Barney Burden, pay any price,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So I think that the conservative republicanism that you and I believe in was a real thing. It wasn't imaginary,
Right.
but it really existed only within the Cold War. And I think once the wall came down, ironically, tear down this wall, moral clarity from RR. Ironically, that was essentially the beginning of the end, I think, of and then I think the raison d'etre of Reagan conservatism ended, and these other factions that were always there but had been kind of dormant were able to reemerge, and it took them a decade or two, but here we are.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That is perfectly well articulated, because when you think about it, and I've given speeches on this one point I'm about to make, and that is, when Reagan left the stage in 1989, there was this clamoring for who would be the next Reagan, because the reality of it was, barking at the door were those things that you just referred to. That stuff that was bubbling beneath the surface that had largely been placated by the Cold War, because we all had a common enemy, right? And we all had a direct focus on the thing that we found to be more threatening. So therefore, all these other things, which we would later in this environment say are threatening, were not as threatening as what we saw coming out of the Cold War. So even the war itself, the cultural changes and sexual revolution, the emergence of women's rights under the Equal Rights Amendments, all these other pieces, we would fight them. There would be skirmishes and there'd be a lot of noise, but they weren't the Cold War itself. They weren't this thing that we could all align to. So when Reagan goes, there was this mad scramble over who would then pick up that mantle to keep this thing together as it has been. And Bush was not the one they thought would do that.
Well, I think if Jack Kemp had a little more of whatever it is that you need, that certain something, I mean, he had some gravitas, he had charisma, but just not enough.
Right.
Kemp would have been the one, because I think Kemp had the conservative bona fides to protect him on the right. In fact, Pat Buchanan, I forget which year it was, but Buchanan even bowed out and said, I'm not going to run for president this year because I don't want to mess up Jack Kemp's chances. We'll split the conservative vote. Right. So Kemp had the conservative credentials, but he also was a compassionate, bleeding heart conservative.
Yes.
So that would have been an option. I also think, I mean, who knows if Colin Powell had run in 96, who knows what might have happened.
It would have changed the game. He would have changed the game in a way, because he would have opened up a whole new lane for Republicans and for the country. The other, I think, seminal moment that could have been a game changer, oddly enough, is John McCain. Because what John McCain wanted to do in 2008 was to create a bipartisan ticket for the first time in our political history.
Lieberman.
Because having been inside the beast of the belly of that beast, and having come under attack by some on this emerging far right, he knew in many respects what lay ahead. And I think that what he had in mind with the idea of reaching across the aisle really would have given the country, and just think about it, Matt, if he had won that election with his Democratic friend sitting next to him as vice president, the national conversations would have changed in so many levels.
Yeah. By the way, I would have been, full disclosure, I would have been vehemently opposed to this. I would have been rioting in the streets, turning over cop cars with my Sarah Palin T-shirt on. But in hindsight, knowing what we know now and the fullness of time, I'd love to play that one out.
Well, I see, and this is where my dangerous side kicks in, because I would have been, yeah, okay, let's do this. Because I love the idea of mixing up and shaking up the political landscape. I do not appreciate deconstructing and destroying it, because when you do that, you create wasteland, which is what we see playing out now.
Yeah.
And so nothing then is allowed to really grow or change, because you sort of salted the earth as you mowed down the trees and the lawn. But I definitely appreciate your point, and I think that's why, in many respects, McCain was pulled off of that notion, but landed on Sarah Palin. And there's a whole lot of backstory and thoughts about how that came about. I remember meeting with Governor Palin in January of 2008, because I was asked to come up to Alaska to solve a dispute between her and the Alaskan Republican Party, because that was fun. And I got back home only to find out a little bit later on that she was on the short list. But the reality of it is, my point is, there are these moments where if we made just a little bit of a pivot, or if we turned the corner a block sooner, a lot of things would be very different for the Republican Party right now. But it still underscores for me, without having to deal with the truth of our tortured history, that this ugliness would still be there, because you would not have effectively dealt with it. And the disgruntled nature that a lot of Republicans found themselves in over many generations, that culminated in, them siding with Trump and sticking with him, and now reaping what we're sowing.
Well, what's crazy to me is Donald Trump told us who he is.
Yep.
It's not a surprise. Trump told us who he is, what he was going to do. And you know who else told us? Kamala Harris. said, I mean, there's like clips of her saying,
I know.
these tariffs by next summer, will be flirting with a recession if he gets. I mean, she kind of nailed it. And yet the voters who had seen the first 4 years of Trump, they know all about the Access Hollywood. They know Stormy Daniels. They know January 6th, inciting a riot. They know about the Mar-a-Lago documents. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Said, give us Barabbas, effectively.
Effectively, that's very well put this Lenten season. I really appreciate that.
I thought you would appreciate the reference,
I like that.
You went to seminary, right?
I did. I spent a few years with the Augustinian order, and I really like that Barabbas analogy. That works because that's essentially what happened. That's essentially what happened, and you see yourselves now looking back and realizing that, wait a minute, did we just free the criminal? I don't know. Did we do that? Yeah, you did. And you gave the criminal power. But look, but this underlines my point about where the Republicans move, because in light of everything you just laid out, and that's the folks, a very short list.
Oh, that's abbreviated.
Yeah. Of the stuff that Donald Trump has done in 6 years in office, let alone when he was out of office. Folks still said, yes, more please. And that, again, speaks to me to the underlying nature, because any party, especially the leadership within that party, would otherwise be repulsed by that. So my point in contrast or comparison would be the Republican Party of the 1950s, when the John Birch Society was beginning to take a stranglehold on the party. There were party leaders who stood up and said, no, we're not doing that. And then advanced further to work with Johnson in 1964 to get the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed, because it was Republican senators who were largely the architects and the political force of will behind the passage. And so Johnson, the segregationist, aligned with Republicans to get that done. But in 64 at the convention, it was the Republican Goldwater who said, basically blowing shit up is not a vice. And if that's what we need to do to not do that, that's what we'll do.
I think the quote was blowing shit up in defense of liberty. No vice.
Well, and right. So the question becomes, Matt, who's defining who's liberty? Right?
Yeah.
Because we're now seeing play out a lot of this noise around this concept of Republican victimhood. Republicans are quick to tell you how oppressed they have been by the mainstream media, and yet and still, that's exactly what they're doing to the press. The very thing that they claimed was done to them, they are now doing. When it comes to how folks are treated by the government, can you imagine? I mean, I hate these analogies, but they're so damn true. If Barack Obama at any point in his 8 years did one of the things that Donald Trump has done just this week.
Yep.
You know what a Speaker Johnson would be saying in the House? He would be calling for impeachment hearings. In fact, ordering
He'd get them. He would get them.
He would
probably be impeached, actually.
Exactly. So but my point is, when you're looking at these moments where the party could turn itself around and say no, it stopped saying no. And
do you think it's possible, though? Because I have gotten the sense that there's a lot of Republicans, a lot of Republican politicians, and a lot of donors who said that, the racism, I'm willing to accept that. Russia kidnapping Ukrainian kids, the price of doing business. Disappearing, Venezuelan hairdressers into,
Right.
Maybe I don't like that, but the stock market's up. That's a deal breaker. So, is there a chance, and I know I'm sounding naive here, but like, is there a chance that the economy is the one thing that that could happen to cause these Republicans to finally turn against Trump?
No, no,
Okay,
because
folks, thanks for watching.
and I say no because they haven't. Donald Trump didn't turn because members of the House or the Senate went to the floor and said, "Mr. President, no, we're not supporting this. In fact, I'm introducing a bill right now to take from you the tariff making power and restoring it to Congress." Right now, is there a bill to do that? Yes, but do you hear any Republicans out here bragging about this bill or forward facedly saying this is what the next move is? No, but
Maybe the one guy in Nebraska, Don Bacon.
maybe the one guy in Nebraska, Don Bacon, and that's about it. But here's the deal. They have not said that. What turned Trump around was not Republicans in the House or Senate. It was the bond market, to your earlier point. It was the market itself that he could not trifle with, that's ultimately said, oh, okay, you want to do this? Okay. Because here's the deal. The market knows China's not afraid of 145% tariffs. Why? Because Americans are the ones who are going to pay for it. Just pick up anything you have right now, folks, as you're watching or listening to this podcast, and look to see where it was made. And I guarantee you, out of 10 items you pick up, at least 8 of them will be made in China. So what are they afraid of? China's already, if you've watched, and this is the power you need to check, is they're already reshaping Asia. They're damn sure reshaping the African continent. And Europe is ready to partner with them. They're already heads of state talking about economic relationships with China. In other words, we don't need Donald Trump and his economy, because to your other point, it may not be as strong as you think it is.
Yeah.
And in fact, Donald Trump has been trying in his own record, at least in the past, not so much right now, but the underlying efforts tells you that the truth remains he likes a weak dollar. He wants the dollar weakened. Now, from what I hear, it's because of his interest in other things like crypto, right? But the reality of it is he ain't about American economic power to the same degree that, going back to how we started the conversation, his predecessors were in line consistently with the bargain for exchange after World War II relative to our economic power. The parts we were willing to give up, the parts we were willing to hold on to, and the parts we were willing to advance. And at the end of the day, supporting all of that is the military alliances that we have, because for the U.S., that's bigger than the dollar.
Yep. And that's why this isn't just about the tariffs. It's about Donald Trump's first term. He doesn't sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership or whatever, the TPP, that would have, allowed us to trade with other Asian countries and I think isolated China. Getting rid of USAID, where we are like investing in Africa and saving lives from AIDS and all of that. I mean, this soft power, when you start alienating Canada and Australia, don't be surprised if they start doing business with China.
Right.
And so, look, I hate to keep going back to the sainted Ronald Reagan, but there's a clip of him going around right now of him talking about how stupid tariffs are. But there's a lot of clips of Reagan. Go watch that great Peggy Noonan written D-Day speech. How much time he talks about our allies. He talks about the Canadians at Juno Beach, and he talks about the British soldiers hearing bagpipes, and and at the time I remember hearing it in the 80s thinking, well, this is poetic, but isn't it a little extraneous to talk about these other countries? It didn't occur to me that he was trying to keep that coalition together for the Cold War from the Allies. And so, but it takes hard work, Michael, as you know, and Donald Trump is doing the opposite. He's pissing away this noblesse oblige relationship that we had as the man on the date, maybe paying for the date. but the world was pretty good for the guy back in whatever era that was.
Well, what I love about what you just said, and it struck me as you were speaking to it, was Reagan in that speech leveled up the equivalency of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech relative to foreign policy. In other words, what Reagan was doing was trying to hold that alliance together and to remind Americans of why that alliance was so important and what the value added was for us, as well as for Europe. Just as King said to the country, his dream about the young black boy and young black girl holding hands with the young white girl and the young white boy was that sort of cultural transition, holding together this idea of America's promise of its diversity, its equity, and its inclusion, right? Because recognizing that that little white boy and that little white girl, her grandmama, his granddaddy, were immigrants to this country who at one time needed America's diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to realize the American dream. And so when you have these two pieces sort of side by side, speaking at two different eras in America's arc of history, one culturally, the other one internationally, you begin to appreciate the value of what these two individuals were trying to say to the American people, appreciate the strength we have and how that strength was built and why that strength is important and why that those things that you may sometimes take for granted matter. And we cannot stop believing in those things because the moment we do, this goes away. And
do you think
we're faced with right now?
Do you think that we have reached a place in American culture where a message like that doesn't resonate with enough real Americans, average Americans? Or is it the case that we are just desperate for the right leader to emerge who can talk that way and persuade the public?
I think that's an intriguing question because my initial, as you were speaking it, my initial thought was no, that person doesn't exist. But then I realized it's actually a combo. I think
Rubio tried this, Jeb Bush tried this, and it didn't.
Right.
John Huntsman tried this; it didn't work for them, and the country preferred, at least Republicans certainly preferred Trump over Rubio.
Time, place, circumstances are the three elements of any action, and any individual who is committing that action. So with respect to those individuals, the time, place, circumstances did not warrant the leadership, the kind of leadership you're talking about, which is what's needed now. So here's the test. Under this time, this place and these circumstances, is there a leader prepared to emerge to be that voice? There is, this idea of premature emergence. That's right. Where you just
there's a pill you can take for that these days, Michael.
Well, you just show up a little too soon, right? You're so
I'm just
bad.
ahead of my time here.
You're just ahead of your time. Everybody's sitting there looking at what you doing here. But so I got to get the visual out of my head. But no, it really is a matter of how the country at various points will say, no, we're not now.
Winston Churchill was in the wilderness warning about Hitler and fascism, and people thought he's a clown, he's a loser.
And exactly, that's a really good example because they wanted to get rid of him.
Yeah.
They were like, no, he can't govern the country. He cannot be prime minister. He's got to go. And then the next thing you know, all of a sudden they realize, oh snap, no, tell him don't leave the office. Lock the door. He ain't going nowhere. But again, the time changed, the circumstances changed, the place changed, meaning the field of violence began to expand. It was no longer contained to just certain parts of Europe. It began to reach, and then of course by 41, the U.S. itself had come under attack. So it became this thing where the urgency of the moment leveled up the leaders. And when you think about the men that emerged in the West, Roosevelt, who was very resistant at one point, but secretly wanted into the war, but the politics didn't allow him to do it, rose to the moment in the well of the Congress and clarified for us what the moment required. The time, the place, the circumstances had changed. And so it was right for him. Same is true for Churchill. And so the question I think Republicans like us ask ourselves is, who now is prepared to rise to this moment, to address this time, the circumstances of these times, and at this place? I don't see that person yet. I hope and pray they do emerge, but they have to be willing to sacrifice something, Matt. And this is something I learned in my years with the Augustinians: is public service. Being a public servant requires you understand it ain't about you, boo. You are the least important person in the room. And the moment you see yourself as the most important, you cannot do the work, because now you have put too much into that persona. You value it more than the work, which means you're not prepared to lose. You're not prepared to lose an election. You're not prepared to lose the argument. You're not prepared to say, I made a mistake. That's Donald Trump wrapped up.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And so now the question is, who emerges in this era to help not so much lead us out, but to set the clarion call that others may find the strength to also lead in this moment? Because I think, Matt, it's going to take more than one person. That age where one person emerges, whether it's someone like a Roosevelt or someone like a Reagan, I think it's going to take multiple personalities collectively reinforcing each other, which is what I was hoping would happen on that stage in 2016, when you had 15 people standing on there who all in any other universe would have beat the hell out of Donald Trump,
Mm-hmm.
capitulated to him, and gave him much more power than he was due or had earned.
I don't want to get too meta or navel-gazy here, or even self-important, but I couldn't help thinking when you were talking about right place, right time, and different leaders emerging and all of that. And I don't want to compare you and I, political commentators or pundits, to statesmen, but I'll just, speaking for myself, there have been times in my life as a commentator when I would be put. It's almost like a WWE match when you're cast as the heel and you're outnumbered and you can't win, and it's a bad venue. And I have to say, I remember you like maybe going on Fox News, trying to find a way to persuade or to, convince people, and it just didn't work. And now I would say for the last several years, man, you are cooking. You have found your voice, your place, and there is a strength and a confidence. Again, I think politicians have it. You could take Churchill in the 1930s,
right,
was in the wilderness, and then he meets his moment. There's one of my favorite movies is that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie, and
Oh
there's
yeah.
that great scene where Pacino takes Leo DiCaprio, and he says like, "Tell me what show were you in last week?" And he's like, "Were you the Heavy? And was there a fight at the end? And did you get your ass kicked?"
Right.
And then Pacino's like, "Every week you're getting your ass kicked at the end of the show, and a couple years of that, there's going to be a psychological effect where
Yeah.
people don't see Joe Blow getting his ass kicked; they see Matt Lewis getting his ass kicked on CNN every week, as a commentator." I don't know what make of that what you will, but I do think that there's something to be said. I can tell you that there are certain times and venues where I think, a much better than I've been maybe like a few years ago on
No,
CNN.
I think that's absolutely true. And for me, it bears out the idea of time, place, circumstances, because right now, and that's why, folks, before Matt and I started talking, I was, lauding him on being on Morning Joe and just kind of drawing out the conversation and with clarity. That's the thing. Look, there's no question about your bona fides, who you are, what you've done. That lends credence to the next word that comes out of your mouth. And the fact that you're committed to delivering the next word is important. You have not been stunted or shuttered in expressing your voice, and at appropriate times, in the right circumstances, comparing and contrasting the Republican idea that you and I are very familiar with over our arc of time in the party against this particular backdrop of what's happening, as a way to remind people that, we once stood with our allies. They weren't all perfect, and the circumstances may not have been the greatest, but we understood fundamentally that important thread that tied us together, that Reagan, Bush, Eisenhower spoke about, that sort of that bond that would define the age. And it did. And it did for a reason. So if we don't have a voice out there that reminds us, at the same time extolling us, to do better than what we're doing right now, the moment's lost. And so I refuse to give up on the moment. You refuse to give up on the moments while you have the various platforms that you have. I come from a position of former elected, so I can speak about that side of it. You come from what I would call the great thinking space, where you've written and you've talked about and articulated sometimes very difficult, arcane policies, real time, in a real voice. Those things are needed right now. And the question is, how do you and I know it's a question I have to deal with every day. So tomorrow, how do I further lean into helping my fellow Americans understand why I say what I say and what I believe right now? It's my friend Simone Sanders Townsend on our show is quick to remind the MSNBC audience, y'all don't forget Michael Steele's still a Republican. So, when we start talking about tax cuts and deregulation, y'all need to be ready, because, he's working with us in democracy, but the policy, he's still a conservative. And so he's going to be very much concerned about, okay, how much involvement does the government have in what we're doing right now? So, but that's okay. That conversation will always be there. But I think right now the more important one is the one you and I have been having, and that is, okay, what is this saying about, at a base level, a Republican Party, but at a broader level, the country that seemingly is okay with a lot of this? I'm sorry. When did we get into book burning again? I don't remember that meeting inside the
Yeah,
Capitol.
there's no
when I
national
was
conversation about that, was there?
Right. Right. So I think you put your finger on an important aspect of this that really belies the question of who emerges, how does that individual emerge? And it makes my point, I think, that it is a combo of various voices that collectively sort of funnels the conversation to a very important point. And for me, it's three words: we the people. We need to get the power back that the founders gave to us. I told an audience recently, Matt, I said, look, a lot of folks in this room, we weren't written, when the Constitution was written, we weren't in that we the people, all men are created equal conversation. We just weren't. But you know what? We are today. We own it today. We're the generation that now are the next architects of what those words mean. And if you're looking at the immigrant history, starting with the folks who got on a boat from England and landed on these shores, do we really think it's consistent with that history to suddenly now build walls and tell people they can't come because their skin's too dark, their surname is unpronounceable? Because there were a whole lot of folks whose skins were dark and surnames were unpronounceable back in 1898 and 1910, right? But today, their families are legacy owners of the American dream. So I've always aspired to that. And I think we all should. And I think your voice is important in helping in that inspiration.
Awesome, my friend. There's been a great deep for those who are sick of rank punditry. We got into some
never do that. The two of us never do. Every conversation we've had it goes the next level.
Let's to be continued. Let's keep it going until the next time. Michael Steele, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
It's great, man. So to return a favor, my folks will be reaching out to share some love and get you over to my podcast in the next few weeks. I think it'll be fun that we can pick up that conversation and go from there.
I would love it. You let me know when.